I was only supposed to be there for 48 hours. That was the deal. 2 nights in the Nevada desert, inside a low-tier logistics bunker used by contract scientists for data transfer, and then back to Maryland for a follow-up briefing. I wasn't a physicist or an engineer or even a particularly high-clearance analyst. I was a systems integration specialist. My job was to ensure that the machines installed on one end of the country would speak properly to the nodes they were supposed to relay to. Satellites, rovers, synthetic intelligence clusters. I wasn't there to ask questions. I wasn't even there to observe. I was just the invisible technician who pressed connect, made sure it didn't blow up, and left without leaving a digital footprint. That's why I still don't understand why they trusted me with that room. It didn't look like anything special. Bunker C3 was windowless, airless, lined with chalk gray composite panels that deadened every footstep. The only furniture was a desk bolted to the wall, a thermoplastic chair, and a refrigeration unit sealed with 3 layers of biometric locks. I wasn't allowed to open the fridge, obviously. No one was. My workbench was a basic encrypted station tethered to an off-grid power supply, with a note taped to the screen that read, Level 3, do not sync external. That was it. 48 hours of verifying firmware for a military uplink that supposedly had something to do with lunar radar arrays. Nothing was supposed to be physically delivered. Nothing was supposed to be left behind, which made the briefcase even stranger. It was there when I arrived, matte black, scuffed, and resting precisely in the center of the floor, as if placed intentionally, like someone wanted it to be found. I asked the airman escorting me about it, but he didn't even glance at it. Don't touch anything that's not yours, he muttered before sealing the door behind me. I scanned the case for explosives. Nothing. No RFID, no pressure sensor, no biometric seal. Just a standard triple-lock Samsonite, which made it even more unusual. Who brings civilian luggage into a Level 3 site? I tried to ignore it for the first hour. Really tried. But every time I looked back at my monitor, a flicker of something would reflect in the glass, like movement, even though I was completely alone. Eventually, I gave in. I told myself I'd just move it to the corner, out of view. But when I bent to lift it, I realized how unnaturally heavy it was. Not like it was full of tools or electronics. More like the mass was dense, as if it were one solid block of something wrong. When I finally popped the locks, a burst of chemical staleness hit my face, the kind of smell that reminded me of antique medical equipment. Metallic, preserved, dry. Inside was a single object, a leather-bound folder, perfectly square, with no title or markings. I held it like it might cut me. The second I lifted the first page, I understood that nothing I knew about the moon, or about the government's intentions with it, had ever come close to the truth. The first page was dated December 11th, 1972. The header read, Operational Notes, Station EOS. Below it, in uneven typewriter ink, was a report that made my stomach tighten. Telemetry from Site Theta confirms non-random echo. Repeating signal matched 4.13-second cycle. Suggests internal heat source or autonomous feedback. Recommend sample retrieval post-EV5. There was a photo paperclipped to the page. Grainy. Dark. Taken from what looked like the shadow of a lunar ridge. The angle made it difficult to discern, but in the center of the frame was a circle. Not a crater. A dome. Smooth. With faint lines radiating outward like veins. Or maybe structural supports. Underneath the image, someone had written in red ink, Still active? The deeper I went into the folder, the more unexplainable it became. Reports from unnamed Apollo astronauts describing tactile vibrations beneath their boots. Instruments that refused to calibrate unless pointed away from certain coordinates. Crew logs redacted with black so dense it scorched the paper. And then there were the code names. Palinglass, Relay Echo, Sleeper Station. Most terrifying was a sketch buried between 2 memos, drawn in what looked like charcoal pencil. A cross-section of the moon's crust, with artificial tunnels descending vertically for miles. At the base was a glyph I couldn't interpret. Not language, not numerals, just a spiral of lines with sharp, abrupt hooks, like claws curling inward. I was sweating. The kind of cold sweat that makes your body forget it's in an air-conditioned room. I had no idea how any of this was here, who left it, who it was for, why it had been left in my bunker. But I knew I had already crossed a line. The smart move would have been to close the case, report the anomaly, and pretend I'd never seen a thing. But I didn't. Because as I flipped through the last page, something fell out. It was a list of names, typed in a format I recognized: military contractor onboarding. It had columns: name, rank, assignment, deployment date. My name was fourth. Assignment: Lunar Logistics Node, Stage Wyver. Deployment: TBD. I sat there for 10 minutes, staring at it. I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't requested transfer. I hadn't even spoken to anyone above level 2 in over a year. And yet somehow I was on a list to be sent to a place that, officially, didn't exist. A place beneath the surface of the moon. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise inside the bunker made me jolt. At 03:24 a.m., a low hum started vibrating through the floor. Not mechanical, not electric, more like pressure. I turned on the console and checked for system diagnostics, all nominal. But the hum didn't stop. And for a moment, I could have sworn it was matching my heartbeat. By the time I left the facility, the briefcase was gone. No sign it had ever been there. But the folder was still in my bag. I hadn't meant to steal it. It had just ended up there, buried between 2 sheets of diagnostics. I didn't report it. I didn't return it. I just drove back east, trying not to think about the names, trying not to dream about a place that wasn't supposed to be real. But even as the desert faded behind me, I could still feel the weight of it pressing against my spine. Not the folder, but the truth it carried. Whatever they were building up there, they hadn't started it. They were just continuing it. Something had come before us. And now, I was part of it. I kept the folder hidden for days. Not just out of fear, though that was part of it, but because I didn't know what to do with it. Every instinct I had, every trace of training from my years in systems security, told me to burn it, dissolve it in acetone, pretend it never touched my hands. But I couldn't. I kept opening it at night like some cursed relic, flipping through the pages under dim light, searching for patterns in the scattered documents, scribbles, and forgotten names. The list of personnel haunted me. I read it again and again, obsessing over the oddities: mismatched ranks, units that didn't exist, entries with only a first name or none at all. There was one that stood out in particular. K. That was all it said. No initials, no role. Just K, and no deployment date. I didn't know why that one line unsettled me more than the rest, but it did. That was the seed of paranoia. It bloomed 2 days after I returned to base when I started noticing him. He looked like every other technician. Gray coveralls, clean shave, eyes that never quite met yours. But there was something about the way he moved. Too precise, too quiet. He never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, only in clipped, non-committal responses. He didn't eat in the mess. He didn't badge in through the main entrance. One time, I passed him in the corridor near the server banks, and I swear he wasn't casting a shadow. I told myself it was the angle, the flickering overhead bulbs, the migraine building behind my eyes. But then I saw him again, and again, always in the periphery, always alone, always watching. I ran a search through the internal roster system. No K. Not under techs, not under logistics, not under anything. That's when I took a risk I shouldn't have. I accessed the back-end clearance logs using a loophole I'd built for troubleshooting legacy encryption modules. Normally, it only tracked systems-level entries, terminal access, firmware changes, data pings. But someone had left an old RFID pingback module active in one of the environmental stations. Every person who passed within its range left a trace. Every person but him. I watched the feed for hours. Dozens of staff moved through the corridor. Each ID pinged, validated, and logged. Then, late at night, there he was. No badge, no ping. Just a figure in gray walking through a supposedly locked zone. I froze the frame, enhanced it as best I could. His face was just wrong. Too symmetrical. Uncanny. Like it had been rendered from a memory of a person rather than a person themselves. That was the night I stopped sleeping entirely. I locked the folder inside a false panel in my floor, and started carrying a burner phone with no GPS chip and a Faraday sleeve. I wasn't being followed. Yet. But something was watching me. Or waiting. It wasn't until my next assignment that things escalated. I was reassigned to a black site in the Aleutian Islands. Remote, frigid, built into the side of a basalt cliff like a scar no one was supposed to see. The manifest said I'd be integrating a new satellite uplink for Arctic telemetry, weather, climate, polar orbits. But the room I was led into didn't have anything resembling comms equipment. It was colder than the rest of the facility, coated in some kind of mineral dust that made my lungs ache. And in the center of the room was a console I didn't recognize. Hexagonal, slate-colored, humming with a low-frequency pulse I could feel in my jaw. It didn't match any tech I'd ever worked with. No ports, no seams, just a central interface and a single inscription along the top edge, etched so faintly I almost missed it. EOS 4.6 C, response pending. That name again. EOS. It kept surfacing, like a wound that never healed. I remembered the document from the folder, the grainy image with the dome, the red ink that read, "Still active?" This was an extension of that. A node. A relay. Or something worse. The technician who briefed me, an older man with the kind of permanent stare that comes from too many years buried in classified work, said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then he asked me one question. "Have you been pre-cleared for Phase E?" I didn't know what that meant. I told him I wasn't briefed on anything above Phase C. His eyes didn't blink. "Then you're not supposed to be here." He left the room, locked the door from the outside. I was alone with the console for 6 hours. It didn't turn on, it didn't transmit, it just hummed, like a warning, or a heartbeat. When they finally let me out, the man was gone. No one would acknowledge he existed. His name wasn't on the personnel log. His clearance ID returned a 404. When I mentioned him to my supervisor, she paused for a moment, then said, "There are no technicians permanently assigned to Site 7A. Must have been a misrouting." But the hum stayed with me. In my bones, in my teeth, in my dreams. I started drawing the glyph from the folder, the spiral with hooks, without realizing it. On napkins, on my arm, on the frost-covered windows of the transport plane home. I wasn't copying it. It was like it was growing inside me. A memory I didn't have yet. That's when I saw K again. At the airport. Just a flash. Boarding a plane marked with diplomatic tags, wearing the same expressionless mask of a man I knew didn't officially exist. This time, he looked at me. Just for a second. A flicker of something behind the eyes. Recognition. Or maybe disappointment. Then he turned away, and the doors closed behind him. I wanted to chase him. Scream. Grab someone and demand they see him too. But I didn't. Because part of me already knew where he was going. He wasn't traveling between bases. He wasn't working on terrestrial projects. He was en route to the launch hub. Because K was already assigned. EOS wasn't just a mission. It was a transfer. And the moon wasn't the destination. It was the interface. The real program, whatever they were building, hiding, waking, was already in motion. And my name was still on the list. It started with a phone call that never rang. I woke up at 03:17 a.m., heart racing, drenched in sweat, with a name echoing in my skull. Kronos Node. I didn't know what it meant, or why it felt like someone had whispered it directly into the base of my brain. But when I checked my secure line, there was a missed call. No caller ID, no timestamp. Just an empty voicemail that lasted exactly 6 minutes and 21 seconds. The only sound was a low, continuous static that vibrated through my headphones in a way that wasn't quite audible. More like a sensation under the skin. I replayed it 5 times. The 6th time, it didn't play at all. The file was gone. By noon, I'd received official orders. I was to report to a temporary debriefing unit operating under Naval Intelligence. Location redacted, transportation classified, no uniforms, civilian clothes, no electronics, not even analog watches. The message was signed with a strange clearance code I hadn't seen before. Omega EOS, Sigma Dusk. I memorized it and burned the page. I packed a single duffel bag with layered thermals and a notebook wrapped in aluminum foil. Not because I believed it would help, but because it made me feel less exposed. The car that picked me up wasn't military. No tags, no markings. Just a matte black 4-door with windows tinted too dark for any legal inspection. The driver never spoke. He never even blinked when I tried to ask where we were going. We arrived somewhere in the desert. I couldn't say exactly where. The route was winding, deliberately confusing, with multiple switchbacks and long periods of complete silence. The compound was buried under a ridge of ochre rock, accessible only through a narrow tunnel that required biometric clearance. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. The lighting flickered inconsistently, as though the fluorescents weren't receiving normal current. Everything felt like it had been built in a hurry, or maybe buried, and then unearthed. I was escorted down a long corridor with no visible cameras, and into a room labeled simply, Echo Briefing, Tier 9. There were no introductions. The man who greeted me didn't wear a name tag or insignia. He was older, thin, with steel-gray hair and a scar along his right cheek that pulsed faintly in the harsh light. He didn't ask me to sit. He just handed me a set of pages held together with a red clip and said, "Read quickly. We're being monitored." The first page wasn't a welcome or an explanation. It was a psychological waiver. It stated in bureaucratic bone-dry language that what I was about to see might result in dissociative episodes, sleep paralysis, fugue states, and spontaneous language regression. I signed it, not because I understood it, but because I knew they wouldn't let me leave if I didn't. The next page changed everything. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly warped, time-stamped January 13th, 1971. It showed the surface of the moon, but not from any Apollo mission I'd seen. In the frame, a shadow stretched across the regolith, long and curved, ending in a structure that couldn't possibly be natural. It looked like an arch, but too perfect, too smooth, and it cast no reflection despite the harsh angle of the sun. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded red ink, "Recovered by Luna 15, quarantined at Tranquility Node. No contact, no origin." I looked up at the man. He stared back with something between exhaustion and dread. Then he told me about Kronos Node. According to him, Kronos was the internal designation for a facility built beneath the moon's surface in the early 2000s. Not on the moon, beneath it. He claimed it was discovered, not constructed. That the initial survey teams found voids deep beneath the Mare Imbrium region that didn't correspond with any known geological models. They weren't lava tubes, they weren't sinkholes. They were geometric, carved, empty, and sealed with an alloy that didn't match any known composition on Earth. "The material isn't the problem," he said. "It's what's behind it." He paused, took out a metal card with a black chip embedded in its center, and inserted it into a nearby terminal. The screen flickered. Then came the footage. Grayscale. Grainy. Dated June 4th, 2009. It showed a small team in EVA suits descending through a narrow shaft with lights mounted on their helmets. The timestamp counted forward. Then, suddenly, all 3 lights disappeared at once. Static took over the feed, and when the image stabilized, it showed the shaft completely empty. No signs of the team, no equipment, no suits. Just a perfectly smooth floor where none had existed before. "That was the last visual record of Alpha Team," he said. "We sent drones after that. None made it back. Some returned corrupted, but not in a technical sense. They returned with footage that couldn't exist." He cued another file. This one was audio only. A low, rhythmic clicking sound played, interspersed with tonal pulses that reminded me of sonar, but backwards, inverted. Every 23 seconds, a voice would whisper something unintelligible. When slowed down, the voice spoke in Latin. "Quod dormiens late," said Vigilat. I knew enough Latin to translate. "What sleeps lies hidden, but watches." That's when I noticed something in the corner of the screen. A symbol, burned faintly into the lower right of every frame. A spiral, like the one I'd seen in the folder from weeks ago. It matched perfectly. He confirmed it before I even asked. "That symbol has appeared in 18 separate intelligence streams, across 7 agencies, spanning over 4 decades, he said. "We don't know what it is, but it always precedes a blackout, a personnel purge, or a launch window." He turned off the monitor. "This briefing didn't happen," he said. "You weren't brought here. There is no Kronos Node." He handed me a sealed envelope with no markings. "When the lights flicker, read this. Only then." And then, without another word, he walked out of the room. I was escorted back to the car. No one looked me in the eye. The road out of the desert felt longer than it should have, and when I checked my duffel bag at the safe house, the envelope was already gone. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the news bulletin I saw later that night. A brief, easily overlooked ticker on a foreign science channel. "Minor seismic activity detected near Mare Imbrium." No official comment from Chinese or US space agencies. I paused the screen, zoomed in, and saw it. In the background, behind the talking head, was an image of the moon taken by a recent orbiter. Near the terminator line, barely visible in the shadow, was a crescent-shaped indentation. It wasn't there a week ago. It looked exactly like a door. And it was open. I didn't sleep for the next 3 nights. Not because of fear, though fear lingered like an electrical buzz under my skin, but because every time I tried to close my eyes, I felt watched. Not in the metaphorical sense. Watched, like being observed from inside my own skull, as if something had reversed the direction of my own perception. On the 4th night, a knock at the door startled me. 3 sharp mechanical taps. I opened it without thinking. No one was there. But on the floor lay a small, rusted cassette tape sealed in a clear, evidence-style bag with no label, just a date. Feb 11, 1993. I didn't own a player, but I knew someone who did. His name was Andrew Halperin. We served together briefly at Point Mugu. He was an acoustics engineer who specialized in subharmonic sonar anomalies. One of the few people I'd ever met who treated silence like a language, not a void. But here's the thing. Andrew was supposed to be dead. He died in 2011. Car crash, total incineration. I remember because I attended the memorial, empty casket and all. Yet 2 hours after finding the tape, I found an anonymous email in my secure inbox. AH requests meeting. Standard protocol, same coordinates. Midnight. Attached was an image of coordinates deep in northern Nevada. A desert airstrip that, officially, didn't exist. I went. Of course I went. There was no wind that night. No sound except the crunch of my boots on gravel. The hangar at the end of the runway looked abandoned, rusted, half-collapsed. But the keypad on the side door glowed faintly green, as if kept alive by something below the surface. I entered the code I remembered from years ago, just out of reflex. It still worked. The lock hissed open. Inside, the air was dry and metallic, like static you could taste. A dim overhead bulb flickered to life, revealing a single figure sitting at a folding table. Back straight, hands folded neatly. It was Andrew. He hadn't aged a day. Not a wrinkle, not a gray hair, not even the slouch he used to carry from years hunched over sonar consoles. He looked at me with hollow, unmoving eyes and said, "You kept the envelope." I didn't answer. I just stared. And I remember thinking, that wasn't Andrew's voice. It was too flat, too deliberate, like someone reciting words they didn't understand. He reached into his coat and pulled out a portable cassette player, inserted the tape, pressed play. What came out was not human. The sound was a blend of low-frequency pulses, distorted breathing patterns, and something that mimicked speech but reversed. Not just backwards, but inverted in tone and structure. I felt my vision ripple, like the edges of the world were being slowly curled inward. And then a phrase repeated, over and over, in English. He spoke twice before being taken. He spoke twice before being taken. Andrew paused the tape, then looked at me. "Do you remember the 2006 transmission?" he asked. I did. Every sonar technician remembers that one. We weren't supposed to talk about it. It was officially classified as a seismic anomaly. But we knew it wasn't. It came from the Mariana Trench. A perfectly symmetrical burst of sound, precisely every 37 seconds, for exactly 3 hours and 6 minutes. It wasn't natural. It wasn't geological. It wasn't ours. And when a recon sub was sent down to investigate, it never returned. Officially, the mission was cancelled due to structural malfunction. Unofficially, the retrieval drone came back with footage that had to be physically burned in an incinerator because no digital device could contain it without corruption. That footage showed something moving along the ocean floor. Not swimming. Not crawling. Moving. As if folded through dimensions. Andrew said something that chilled me. The same signal is repeating. But this time, it's not coming from the trench. It's coming from the moon. I laughed. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't make the leap fast enough. "What do you mean it's coming from the moon?" I asked. He didn't blink. "The pulse is identical. Same frequency, same cycle, but now it's bouncing off lunar sublayers. It's not just being broadcast, it's being received." He stood slowly, as if gravity didn't fully apply to him. "They think it's a loop, but it's not. It's a reply." That's when I noticed his hands were shaking. Slightly, but rhythmically. Not from stress, but like a tuning fork that had been struck too hard. I asked him why he wasn't dead. His answer made no sense, but it also made too much sense. "I was removed," he said. "Reassembled. Returned. He rolled up his sleeve. His forearm was covered in a grid of small circular scars. 17 in total, arranged in a hexagonal lattice. They thought I was a receiver, he whispered. But I was only ever the cable. The bulb overhead flickered and then dimmed. Outside, a low humming began to pulse through the ground. It felt seismic, but there was no quake. Just resonance, as if something beneath us had begun to spin. Andrew turned toward the back wall of the hangar and pressed his palm against it. A section of the panel slid open, revealing a staircase that descended into complete blackness. "It's still down there," he said. "The object. They tried to contain it, but it's not a thing. It's a passage." I didn't follow him. I couldn't. Something in my bones screamed that if I took even one step down that stairwell, I wouldn't come back. I turned and walked out into the night, breathing air that now felt too light, too clean, like it had been filtered of something essential. When I reached the edge of the airstrip, I looked back. The hangar was gone. Not dark, not hidden. Gone. Just sand and flat dirt, as if it had never existed. I drove back to the safe house in silence. No radio, no lights. When I got there, my notebook had been opened. The pages weren't written in my handwriting anymore. They were filled with strange, spiral glyphs etched deep into the paper like scars. And in the center, on the last page, one phrase had been written in perfect block letters. He spoke twice. That's when I realized something. I had heard that phrase before. Not from Andrew. Not from the tape. But years ago, during a failed comms test in the Arctic Circle, when an experimental sonar buoy had picked up a signal no one could trace. It had only lasted 4 seconds. But the data analyst who decoded it had burst into tears. He said the message was the same. He spoke twice before being taken. That analyst later disappeared. They said he retired. But I never saw his name on any clearance roll again. I stayed up all night reviewing everything I had. Notes, briefings, the photograph of the lunar arch. But it all led to the same conclusion. The structure on the moon wasn't alien in the way we imagined. It wasn't a ship or a base or a relic. It was a speaker. And we weren't just listening anymore. We were being called. For 3 days, I didn't speak a single word. Not to a person. Not even to myself. It wasn't out of paranoia or trauma, though I had both in equal measure by then, but because I was afraid that if I spoke, something would answer. The house was silent. The kind of silence that compresses your ears like you've dived too deep too fast. I'd unplugged every electrical device, stripped the walls down to the drywall to make sure no wires ran where they shouldn't. I threw my phone into a ravine. Still, the pressure persisted, a constant thrum in the back of my skull, like a frequency I was no longer just hearing but remembering. On the 4th day, I received a package. No label, no return address. Just a worn-out manila envelope sealed with wax. Military grade, the kind used in Cold War briefings. Inside were 3 items. A single microcassette labeled Phonemic Sequence 7C, a photograph of what looked like lunar regolith imprinted with non-human boot marks, and a declassified memo from 1962. The memo was from the Naval Oceanographic Office, but the date was wrong. It said October 4th, 1962, 2 years before that office officially existed. The memo's title, Lexicon Initiative, Preliminary Observations on Unnatural Speech Patterns Recovered from LAMO 3 Lunar Echo Bounce. That was the moment I realized this didn't start with us. It didn't even start with the moon. The moon was just a mirror. There had been signals before. Not just sonar anomalies, vocal signatures. Sequences that didn't match any known linguistic structure, but still carried the shape of speech. Some were buried in seismic recordings. Others in intercepted shortwave broadcasts from Soviet submarines that had vanished without a trace. The memo described these anomalies as perceptual linguistics divorced from cognition. Language not meant to be understood, only received. I bought a microcassette player from a thrift shop 20 miles out. The woman behind the counter stared at me too long when I asked for it. Not suspicious, not friendly, just too long. I listened to the tape in the trunk of my car, parked under a metal bridge far from cell towers. It began with static, then deep, chest-vibrating tones. Guttural but deliberate, like an animal trying to imitate human phonetics. The sounds didn't match any natural form of communication, but I understood them. Not the meaning, but the structure. It was asking something, over and over again. The question was not in words, but in timing, in inflection, in mathematical emphasis. It asked, "Have you returned to where you came from?" That night, I dreamed in pulses. Not images, not memories. Just sonic waves folding into themselves. When I woke, there were blood spots on my pillow. Not from my ears, from my teeth. I had been grinding them so hard in my sleep that 2 molars had cracked down the center. And when I went to the mirror, I saw something worse. A small bruise on my temple, shaped like a symbol. I recognized it immediately. It was the same spiral shape burned into Andrew Halperin's notebook. The same one etched into the lunar photo that came with the memo. I knew I was being exposed to something beyond language. Beyond data. A signal not meant to be interpreted but to reformat. Not the world, but the listener. That's when I remembered something from years ago. From my first months as a sonar technician. During a training briefing, one of our instructors went off script. He was an old officer, navy gray with a voice like gravel. He said, "If you ever hear something that feels too symmetrical, turn it off. Immediately. Before it starts talking back." We all laughed, thought it was superstition. But now I knew what he meant. Patterns have power, especially ones that don't originate from us. I needed answers from someone who'd been closer to the edge than I ever had. Someone who hadn't just heard the signal, but survived it. That's when I remembered Dr. Samira Chowdhury, a former linguistics expert who'd worked on Project Orpheus, the NSA's black-budget attempt to decode non-human vocal patterns allegedly recovered from polar ice cores in the 1980s. The official story was that she'd resigned after a breakdown. The truth was, she had disappeared for 6 months, then showed up at her home with no memory of where she'd been. But she could speak in tongues no one could translate, not even herself. I tracked her to a monastery in northern Vermont, where she lived in complete silence, working as a gardener. She looked 10 years older than her file photo, but her eyes were clear, like someone who'd come out the other side of fire without a single scar, but had seen every flame. I didn't need to say anything. She took one look at me and simply nodded. She led me to a small room with nothing in it but a desk, a single notepad, and a speaker that looked like it had been modified by hand. She placed her finger over her lips and pressed play. The sound that came out wasn't like the others. It was delicate, tonal, like a whisper trapped in glass. And then it changed. It became a perfect mimicry of my own voice. Not words I had spoken, but thoughts I hadn't said out loud. It recited the memory I had of Andrew, of the moment he rolled up his sleeve, word for word. Samira stopped the recording and scribbled a single word on the notepad. Mimesis. Then below it, "The signal doesn't want to be decoded. It wants to become you." She handed me another envelope. Inside were research notes, most of them scorched around the edges. Pages filled with phonetic diagrams, harmonic spectrums, and one repeating phrase in multiple languages, including Latin, Sumerian, and something unidentifiable. The message is older than its sender. As I left, she pressed a small radio receiver into my hand. "When it begins again," she whispered, her first and only words to me, "don't speak, not even in your mind." I returned home and sealed every mirror in the house, turned off every speaker. But at 3:11 a.m., the receiver she gave me clicked on. A low, rhythmic pulse came through. Then silence. Then one word. My name. Spoken in my own voice. Not a recording. Not an imitation. Something speaking as if it had always been me. I felt something shift in my spine, like a tuning fork had been struck inside my vertebrae. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then the pulse repeated. And again. Until I realized it wasn't a signal anymore. It was a countdown. And something was answering. From the moon. From the ocean. From within. The countdown never finished. It simply stopped. Cut to black silence as if whatever was speaking had changed its mind. Or recalculated. But the effect lingered. I walked differently after that. Not limping. Not slower. Just differently. Like I was adjusting for a frequency I could feel in my bones, but no longer locate. My balance shifted. My appetite dropped. I stopped dreaming altogether. And then came the headaches. Not ordinary pain, but something tighter. Sharper. Like my skull was no longer calibrated for whatever had been planted inside. The signal hadn't just spoken. It had altered something structural. Fundamental. I began going through Samira's envelope page by page, And one word kept surfacing in her research. Palimpsest. Not in the literary sense. She was using it to describe people. People overwritten. Consciousness reused. She cited 5 names, each listed as casualties in separate government experiments spanning 30 years, none publicly acknowledged. Tolwyn, Stratusfield, Fort Ossa, Rimline, and one simply labeled Ark. She'd underlined that last one 3 times. I knew Ark. It was whispered about during my sonar tech days as a place no one came back from. A facility in Antarctica so remote that even satellite imagery gave up trying to map it. According to Samira, that's where they first heard it. Not from the ocean. From under the ice. The official story was a geological research base under multinational jurisdiction. But I remembered something strange from a sonar cross-training operation back in 2007. We intercepted a signal off the Wilkes landmass concentration. Thought it was just seismic feedback, until the technician monitoring the waveform had a seizure. He couldn't stop saying the word return over and over again. Eyes rolled back, frothing at the mouth. He survived, but never came back to the station. The rumor was they flew him straight to Ark. I pulled every old contact I had left. Half of them ignored me. A few weren't alive anymore. One finally responded, a former Navy cryptologist named Byrne who'd gone completely off the grid after an op in the Indian Ocean. He didn't talk about the signal, but he sent coordinates. 74 digs, 126 degree E. That was Ark. I used a stolen Antarctic survey clearance, posed as a contractor for a defunct Swedish telecom firm. And after months of prep, I made it there embedded in a supply drop team. The station was barely a station, more like the fossil of one. What remained above ice was hollowed out and silent, covered in permafrost and rust. Inside, the walls were tagged with numbers, but not sequentially. Fragments. Palindrome codes. Date stamps that didn't follow any recognizable calendar. But the elevator still worked. It descended without friction, silently. There were 30 levels. Only 3 were accessible without key clearance. But someone had pried open the control panel and rewired the circuit manually. Someone had wanted others to go deeper. The 31st floor wasn't a room. It was a tunnel. Natural, not carved. The rock here wasn't like anything I'd seen in sonar readouts. Too smooth, too old. The air smelled of copper and ammonia and something else. Something like ozone, but inverted. Like the air was remembering the future. I found what looked like a control room built into the ice. Monitors were still running. Power source unknown. One screen displayed a spectrogram in constant loop. The signal. The same waveform from the cassette Samira gave me. Except this time it wasn't static. It was reacting. To me. Every time I exhaled, the waveform peaked. Every time my heart skipped, and it had begun skipping every few beats, the signal echoed in real time. This wasn't sonar. This was biofeedback wired into a signal system older than our species. I accessed the terminal. One folder was unlocked. It was labeled Litost Aeon. Inside were hundreds of audio files, all dated between 1958 and 1963. One was tagged Original Contact. I played it. It wasn't what I expected. No language, no hum, just silence. Long. Waited. Then, a single tone. Low and pure. Like a tuning fork pressed to the soul. And over it, a voice. Human. A man, probably military. He was whispering coordinates. Not oceanic. Lunar. He ended with one sentence. They built the ice to keep it from leaking out. I don't know how long I stood there, listening. Maybe hours. Time didn't function normally in that tunnel. I remember touching the wall and feeling a pulse. Biological. Faint. As if the mountain itself was breathing. That's when the lights shut off. No click. No failover. Just instant black. The kind that makes your pupils feel like they're being pulled inward. Then came the sound. Not from outside, but inside the bone. A scraping. A shifting. Like glass reorganizing itself at the molecular level. I fumbled for the emergency light on my vest. When I turned it on, I wasn't alone. Something was standing at the far end of the tunnel. Not moving, not breathing. Its shape was human only in outline. Everything else was wrong. Limbs slightly too long. Neck too still. Skin like ice that had been melted and refrozen over and over again. And where its mouth should have been, there was only indentation. A smooth, concave surface etched with lines. Lines that formed symbols. The same ones from the lunar soil. The same ones Samira had drawn in her notes. It raised its hand. Not in greeting, but in imitation. A gesture it had observed and was repeating without comprehension. And then it opened its chest. Inside, instead of organs, there was a nest of wires. No, not wires. Filaments. Organic and alive, twitching slightly, responding to my breathing. At the center of the chest cavity sat a device. Ancient, yet unmistakably artificial. A small, rotating sphere made of stone and metal, suspended in nothing. And in that moment, I realized the truth. We didn't build the moon base because we found something on the moon. We built it because of what came back from it. The first mission wasn't in 1969. The first mission was in 1958, and it wasn't manned by astronauts. It was manned by this, and whatever this was, it hadn't just returned. It had brought back a map, a seed, one that was buried in the ice long before our species even walked. The experiment wasn't to understand the signal. The experiment was to become it. And somewhere deep in Ark, beneath 20,000 years of ice, something had finished listening. I didn't remember climbing out. I remember only the cold, not as a temperature, but as a presence that didn't belong to this planet. It wasn't something I fought against. It was something that observed me. Inside Ark, beneath that many meters of compressed ice and ghosted metal, something had turned every idea I had of self into a suggestion. I had left the tunnel, but something had not left me. For days after, my vision shimmered at the edges, like the air itself was bending around me, or I was bleeding into a frequency I couldn't hear. I couldn't speak without forgetting a word midway through. Names felt foreign. Time, elastic. I wasn't sure what was happening until I got back to the surface and realized my wristwatch was 4 minutes ahead. Not of UTC, but of cause and effect. I saw a bird lift into flight seconds before it flapped. I spoke a sentence, and then heard myself say it. Something in that tunnel had decoupled memory from chronology. When I finally got back to the outpost, I expected to be quarantined or even shot. Instead, the other surveyors acted like I hadn't gone anywhere. One of them, a Russian geologist named Morozov, told me I'd spent the past 20 hours sleeping in the cot behind the comms console. Like the rest of us. I didn't argue. I just watched. None of them blinked the way people blink. Their eyes stayed open too long. Or not at all. And when one of them lit a cigarette, the flame flickered in reverse, collapsing inward instead of blooming outward. I didn't know if it was them or me. I only knew the station was wrong now, and staying meant becoming part of the wrongness. I hitched a ride on the first icebreaker convoy back north and ditched my ID as soon as we passed the 60th parallel. I no longer trusted who I was, or who I might have been before. Names felt like costumes. I went by an alias, stayed off the grid, took cash jobs, but I kept the hard drive. Samira's folder, the waveform, the terminal logs from Ark, all of it. I stored it across 4 encrypted flash arrays hidden in old GPS units, each one modified to self-wipe if scanned by commercial hardware. It didn't matter. Whatever had changed me at Ark had already begun leaking out. It started with my dreams returning. Not just ordinary ones. Recursive loops, fractal landscapes, oceans that whispered numbers, and cities made of reversed sound. But more disturbing than the dreams were the false memories that followed. Entire conversations I never had. Missions I never served. I recalled a base under the Mariana Trench, assigned to monitor a pulse that moved horizontally across tectonic plates. I remembered colleagues with faces I couldn't draw, but whose names came to me in the dark. Latine Kessler, Radioman Chu, someone called only the Archivist. And I remembered something worse. I remembered being someone else, not metaphorically, literally. A man with no affiliation to the Navy, born in 1932, whose body had died during an operation called Project Samovar. And I remembered the moment he died, not as an image, but as sensation. The panic, the pressure, the unbearable awareness of being witnessed by something older than time, then silence, and then waking up in my own bed, decades later, with blood in my ears and words in my mouth I didn't recognize. Samira had called it palimpsest consciousness. Layers. Overwriting. Not possession, but something more clinical. A form of operating system overwrite, directed by a signal. And ARC hadn't been the source, only the relay. The signal was older, much older. The lunar coordinates from the original audio transmission pointed to a region on the far side of the moon, just off the rim of Hertzsprung Basin. But here's what kept me awake at night. The data from ARC showed the signal change direction in cycles. It didn't just emit. It pulsed inward, then out again. Like breath. I began analyzing the waveform again. Each loop contained minor deviations. What appeared at first to be random static turned out to be discrete packets. Embedded data. Binary. But not ASCII or any known digital encoding. When I ran the data through a Fourier transform, a pattern emerged. Not numbers, not letters. Maps. Topographic renderings of underwater terrain. The coordinates matched the Pacific Ocean, but the formations were not geological. They were architectural. Structures, deep beneath the seabed, encased in basalt and obsidian, older than tectonic drift. I found one pattern that repeated every 11 hours, 38 minutes. A spiral array centered on the Challenger Deep. At its core, a glyph, not a symbol from any known language, but a shape I'd seen before. In Samira's journal, in the chest cavity of the thing I saw in the tunnel, and on the lunar soil, in a declassified photo from an Apollo mission that supposedly lost exposure. The glyph wasn't just a signature, it was a signature key, a trigger for recognition. Like a password, but biological. A sequence of form that, when seen, caused a response not in cognition, but in blood. I ran a test, showed the glyph to 3 unsuspecting individuals on different continents via an anonymous art forum. 2 reported intense nausea. 1 reported spontaneous nosebleeds, and couldn't recall submitting the response. The 4th never replied. I later found an obituary. Cardiac arrest, age 29. Cause of death listed as unknown arrhythmia. Time of death, 11:38 a.m. The signal was reaching through us, not to communicate, to prepare. And the moon base? That wasn't construction, it was containment. The structures on the ocean floor matched the geometry of what was being built under the lunar regolith. A mirrored network, Earth and Moon, both configured as terminals in a system larger than either. And then it happened. I was at a bus terminal in Croatia, watching the crowd move like static through a signal jam. Suddenly, everything froze. Not motionless, but trapped between frames. A woman mid-laugh with no sound. A child mid-stride, one foot never touching ground. And over it all, a tone. Not audible, not real, felt. The same tone from the ARC-H recording. I opened my mouth to scream and sand poured out. I don't remember collapsing. I woke in a clinic near Rijeka with my name registered as Aleksandar Varin, age 48, no known family, found unconscious near the ferry docks. The attending nurse said I'd spoken for hours in my sleep, a language no one recognized. I asked for a pen. My hand shook as I wrote the glyph. She fainted on sight. Something had been activated, not just in me, in us. The signal was no longer just a frequency. It had become a memory, one not bound to time, not even to self. We were all palimpsests now. And the experiment wasn't to see if we could withstand the message. It was to see if we could hold the memory of what sent it. I boarded a cargo vessel from Rijeka bound for Egypt, hiding among the pallets of copper wiring and industrial filtration units, keeping my head down while the signal tried to rewrite everything I thought was mine. It was no longer just residual interference. The glyph had etched itself into my perception, a kind of perceptual parasite that refused to stay dormant. I would wake up hearing snippets of voices in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Conversations halfway through where I wasn't the speaker, but I was the listener. Not metaphorically. I mean that when I closed my eyes, I could feel the memory of a conversation I had never physically participated in. Yet I remembered the inflection of each syllable. I began losing hours, then days. In Port Said, I met a man who called himself Elias. He was waiting at the dock before the ship even moored, holding a thermos of bitter coffee and a folder marked in pencil with a name I hadn't used since a joint exercise in 2007. He didn't ask how I'd gotten there. He handed me the folder and said only, "They already know." Inside were satellite images, sonar pings, and diagrams of a structure I hadn't seen in over a decade. Project Dreadnought. The diagrams matched the patterns embedded in the ARC waveform. Exactly. The shape, the scaling, the phasing windows. But Dreadnought wasn't supposed to exist. It had been scrapped in 2009, buried after a failed phase resonance experiment ruptured the inner hull of the test array and left 3 contractors with nervous systems that no longer registered linear input. They could hear the past, see motion in rewind. One of them had drawn the glyph over and over across the walls of the infirmary until he went blind. I asked Elias where he got the data. He said it came from a former naval contractor in Kazakhstan who died under routine circumstances. Gunshot to the back of the head, classified as a car accident. The drive he left behind had one file. A decrypted sequence from the moon. Not a message, but a response. A directed echo, meaning the signal from the seabed was not merely broadcasting. It was triggering a reply from the structure on the lunar surface. And not just in radio, in memory. The echo wasn't a sound. It was a concept, folded and transmitted as waveform, encoded in psychic subharmonics that could only be received by systems dense enough to remember physics itself. Biology, the brain. Elias called it informational recursion. I called it something worse, viral cognition. The idea that memory could be infected not by suggestion or narrative, but by frequency. The kind of infection that didn't replicate. It overwrote. That's why the glyph kept appearing in places it shouldn't. It wasn't being drawn. It was being remembered into existence. I flew with Elias into the interior of Egypt, near a restricted zone east of the Libyan border, where a private station had been constructed over what appeared to be an unlisted magnetic anomaly. From above, it looked like rock. From below, it was a trapdoor. They called it Station Q7, and it had been active since 2014, not under NASA or the ESA, but a hybrid program involving a ghost branch of the United Arab Emirates, Lockheed Black Ops, and something called Section 9K. I recognized the insignia. We'd been warned about them during acoustic warfare training. If you hear them, you're already too close. Inside Station Q7, the walls pulsed. Not visually, sonically. The room was in constant micro-vibration, like being in the throat of something large, something swallowing. They had records of similar anomalies found at deep ocean trenches, mostly near subduction zones. Each one emitted a low-frequency hum measured at 13.9 dB, which should have been inaudible, but wasn't. The technicians called it the voice. They said prolonged exposure made your skin itch with static and your blood hum like it wanted to leave your body. One man was found standing in a pool of his own teeth, having pulled them out one by one, smiling through it. They let me hear the voice. I told them I already had. It was the same tone from Ark, the same pulse from the glyph, but layered now, deeper, more mature. It had grown since Ark, like it was learning. We weren't decoding it. It was decoding us. That's when they brought out the sphere. Roughly the size of a human torso, matte black, no visible seams. They found it buried 2 kilometers beneath the trench. No metal alloys matched. No known carbon aging was possible. It vibrated in prime number intervals. And when exposed to the tone, it shimmered. Not with light, but with absence. A void shimmer. I felt nausea immediately. Then something worse. The sensation that I was being watched from inside myself. A cognitive intrusion. But not like a virus, not digital. Intimate. Like being remembered by something else. The glyph began to appear in my vision again, but this time it morphed. Not drawn, but alive. It unfolded. That's when I remembered something I'd never been told. The moon base wasn't meant to contain the signal. It was meant to replicate the effect. A mirror, tuned to Earth's core. The project name was Lucent, Lunar Cognitive Entanglement Transmission. The idea wasn't new. In 1981, a Soviet experiment in Novaya Zemlya attempted to entangle the minds of 6 volunteers with a sample of lunar basalt. The experiment ended after only 4 hours. One participant's skull began to collapse. The others tried to speak in numbers. Not equations, just numbers. Unending. Recursive. They died mumbling primes into the concrete. The lunar structures weren't alien, at least not in construction. They were built by us, under instruction. From where, no one could say. But the implication was clear. The glyph wasn't a language. It was a memory bootloader. Something you didn't read, but executed. And once executed, it used the brain's electrical map as storage. The human mind was a host, and the signal was the code. I asked Elias how many had seen it. He didn't answer. He only asked, How many versions of yourself do you remember being? I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't sure which one was replying anymore. When I left Station Q7, I took nothing physical. They wouldn't let it. But I didn't need to. I could already hear the pulse again, even with no equipment, not sound, cognition. Every time I closed my eyes, the echo repeated. Not as voice, as place. I could feel it now. A structure buried inside memory itself. Architectural recursion. Geometry embedded in concept. The moon wasn't the end point. It was the first visible layer. And whatever we were building up there, we weren't doing it alone. The design wasn't ours. It was a memory from something older than language, older than flesh. Something that once used the moon the way we now use sonar buoys. Not to speak across space, but to wake things up. I made it back to the mainland with 3 days missing from my personal timeline. That was becoming a pattern. Days erased, only to return in slivers, fragments out of sync. I'd find a shirt in my duffel bag I didn't remember buying, ticket stubs to locations I never visited, and once, a receipt for a transorbital launch window reservation. Non-refundable. The coordinates printed on it didn't correspond to any known launch site, but the frequency did. It was stamped with the number 211 ARC, the same identifier I had seen etched into the sphere at Station Q7. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence, some leftover notation copied onto various systems without deeper meaning, but I knew that was a lie. The glyph had infected my rationality. I wasn't interpreting the world anymore. I was remembering it differently. A man named Keller met me in Berlin. He didn't have a last name, or maybe he did, but people like him shed identities like snakeskin. He called himself a neural synchronist, a title I'd never heard before, but which made a sick kind of sense once he explained. According to Keller, the government had moved beyond simple surveillance and into preemptive memory containment. They were no longer reacting to threats. They were predicting them based on the architecture of thought patterns, emotional signatures, and susceptibility vectors triggered by encoded stimuli. It wasn't psychological profiling. It was topological forensics of cognition, and it was all based on a single principle. Once a thought became too aligned with the glyph, it had to be intercepted before it became self-executing. That was the purpose of the Mindprint protocol. Keller showed me a classified archive of case files. Hundreds, maybe thousands. People who had encountered the glyph not through sonar or signal exposure, but dreams, migraines, architectural déjà vu. The same pattern had emerged in places no one could trace. On napkins, carved into sand at the edge of receding tides, or scratched onto the inside of chapel walls sealed since World War II. In every case, the pattern triggered something in the mind of the observer. Not hallucinations, but structural edits. One subject reported waking up in a house she had never lived in, with photos of a life she didn't recognize lining the walls. Another, a former shuttle technician, began to speak fluently in a language identified only as reconstructed Proto-Elamite. He claimed it wasn't speech. It was a memory being played back. The glyph wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. It didn't cause immediate harm. It didn't emit radiation, transmit disease, or send kill signals. It simply existed. And by existing, it spread. Keller said the key wasn't in its shape, but its orientation through time. The glyph was four-dimensional. What we saw was the flat cast shadow of a rotating memory object, a concept whose full form our minds couldn't contain without sacrificing stability. And yet we were trying to interface with it anyway. He asked if I'd seen it in reverse. I didn't understand. Keller then activated a simulation on a secure device, replaying the glyph as an audio-visual waveform, but mirrored. Not horizontally, not vertically, temporally. When played backwards, the signal resolved into a harmonic plateau that matched a brain state seen only during terminal phases of hypoxia-induced hallucination. Keller explained that these were not accidents. The glyph was designed to simulate death, or more precisely, the memory of death. That's how it spread, through emotional familiarity. It wasn't a weapon. It was a return protocol. He believed the moon base was being built to facilitate controlled exposure to the glyph at scale. The mind couldn't survive unmediated contact on Earth, not without catastrophic cognitive overlap. But on the moon, in isolation, they could filter it, attenuate the signal, regulate the depth of memory reconstruction. The base wasn't a bunker. It was a memory chamber, a vault, not for secrets, but for selves. and each self exposed to the glyph would begin to write back to it, transmitting emotional signatures that could be folded and compressed into usable mind prints. That was the second half of the protocol. Once someone was exposed, they were tagged, neurologically. A low-frequency EEG signature began to emerge in their baseline pattern, what Keller called liminal harmonic imprinting. It was the brain's attempt to stabilize after being bent through a memory that didn't originate from itself. The tag wasn't conscious, but it could be tracked. And more importantly, it could be used to reconstruct the memory vector that led to glyph exposure. In other words, if you had it, they knew where you'd been, and more importantly, what version of you had returned. Because the glyph didn't just change how you remembered, it changed which version of you got to remember. Keller took me to an underground annex beneath the Humboldt University. The door required both retina scan and vocal code, spoken in a tone modulated to match the original EEG pattern of the subject being stored inside. Stored was the correct word. Dozens of cryosuspended volunteers, if you could call them that, floated in biotanks, each connected to an acoustic loop. They were being recorded, Keller said. Not their words, their thought shapes, patterns of reflection, emotion, and semantic density, stored in a medium Keller refused to name but which looked disturbingly organic. I asked how long they had been down there. He told me one of them had been recording since 1994. I recognized her. She had been my instructor during sonar school in Coronado. I remembered her as sharp, skeptical, alive. But in the tank, her skin was waxen, and her pupils dilated with a kind of artificial stillness that felt less like sleep and more like waiting. Her glyph was active. I could feel it before I even stepped into the room. Not see it, feel it. My heartbeat synchronized to it. My thoughts slowed. Not from fear, from familiarity. She had been exposed before anyone even understood what the glyph was, and she was still broadcasting. Keller told me the recordings were being beamed to the moon base in tight beam laser packets, mind prints, compressed and calibrated to induce controlled glyph resonance in the lunar receivers. They were building a library, not of knowledge, but of human templates, memories that had been altered, overwritten, reconstructed through the glyph's recursion. The idea was simple. If the glyph was a doorway, then they wanted to know which versions of us could walk through it and return. I asked him what happened to the versions that couldn't. He didn't answer. But I saw the locked door at the end of the corridor, frost on the inside, and a symbol, not the glyph, but close, a variation, as if it had evolved. Later that night, I tried to sleep in the university archives. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered something else. Not a dream, but a place. A structure under black stone, lit by breath alone. And someone whispering in a voice that sounded like my own, saying just one word. Again. I woke to the smell of dust and static. The kind that clings to data tapes and old monitors left too long in sleep mode. I hadn't really slept. I knew that much. My body had shut down the way a machine does after an overload, but my mind had remained active, replaying a single moment on loop. The frozen door with the evolved glyph. Not just remembered, but inhabited. Each time I blinked, I felt my consciousness slide a little further from the version of myself I knew. I could still recite my name, my service number, the serial designations of every sonar module I'd ever worked with, but they no longer felt anchored. Like information preserved in a dead man's notebook, technically accurate, but existentially obsolete. Keller was gone when I left the archives. No note, no trace. Only a sealed envelope taped to the terminal I had been using, with my name, my full name, handwritten in block letters. Inside, a single Polaroid photo. It showed a man who looked almost exactly like me, standing in front of a lunar regolith processing facility. Same posture, same jawline, same scar above the brow. But his eyes were wrong. Not vacant, just too focused, as if whatever was behind them had already moved on from this world. On the back of the photo, 4 words had been stamped in red. Version 3. Full return. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But I understood the implication. They weren't just building a database of mind prints on the moon. They were running simulations, live reconstructions of human beings, based on the memory imprints recorded from glyph exposure. Not copies, not clones. Versions, and some of those versions had returned. I needed answers from someone who wouldn't speak in riddles. That meant locating Richter. Commander Richter was a name I hadn't heard since Project Overture. the aborted initiative to develop deep ocean listening arrays that could detect tectonic subharmonics. But Overture was a lie. It wasn't about the Earth at all. It was about space. Specifically, using terrestrial resonant frequencies to map subsurface lunar caverns. And Richter was the only one who knew how the two connected. Finding him meant going back to where it started. White Sands, New Mexico. Officially decommissioned, unofficially humming with more energy than a lunar reactor core. The passcode Keller had burned into my memory still worked. 19 Hex Delta 9. I spoke it into the intercom, and the door opened without hesitation, like it had been waiting for me. Richter wasn't surprised to see me. "You're the original, right?" he asked, not looking up from the data stream flickering across a suspended LED sheet. "You still have bone density. That's one of the first things they lose." "They?" I asked. He finally looked at me. "The returned." Richter explained it calmly, the way a surgeon explains a terminal diagnosis to someone else's family. After exposure to the glyph, certain individuals entered what he called recursive displacement. Not teleportation, not possession. Just dislocation. Temporally, psychologically, sometimes physically. The self peeled into iterations, forks in the mental operating system. The brain couldn't house them all, so it expelled them. Where they landed, no one knew. But some found their way back. And when they did, they were different. "They come back with knowledge they shouldn't have," Richter said. "Star charts we've never published. Rituals we never taught." One of them constructed a fully working particle delay harmonizer, using only plastic spoons, circuit boards from a defunct Sega console, and a chant in cuneiform we haven't even decrypted yet. "But how do you know they're versions?" I asked. "Not just hallucinating?" Richter pulled up a video file. Surveillance footage. Frame-stamped. Verified. It showed a young woman waking up inside a lunar decontamination chamber. Medical personnel tried to approach her, but she refused to speak. Not angrily, just with a quiet, perfect stillness. Then she reached behind her ear and pulled out a small disc, slid it across the floor. The guards froze. The disc began to glow, not with light, but with something Richter called pattern bleed, the visual echo of neural reentry. She whispered a string of numbers. When played backward, they aligned perfectly with the harmonic signature of the glyph. "She shouldn't have known that," Richter said. "She wasn't even exposed long enough to see the pattern. And yet, she returned carrying it." "And the others?" I asked. "The ones who come back but don't talk?" "They don't have to," Richter replied. "They leave residue." He led me to a sealed chamber labeled Aeon 6. Inside, nothing but a chair, a microphone, and a stack of paper that had been blank 48 hours earlier. Now, page after page bore the same symbol, drawn with increasing precision. Not just the glyph, but its variants. Iterations none of us had seen, but which carried harmonic signatures matching lunar anomalies first detected in 2022. Richter believed these were not symbols of power, but coordinates of return. Triggers. Keys. "Each version brings back a different slice of the glyph," he said. "Eventually, we'll have the full structure, and when we do..." I didn't let him finish. I asked what the moon base's true function was. Not the cover story, not the tech, but the real operational objective. He sighed. "Containment was a lie," he said. "So was exploration. The base exists because Earth can't handle what's coming." "What's coming?" He pointed at the wall. A timeline was etched into the concrete. At the very end, a date I had seen before. On the sphere, on the photo, even on the receipt Keller showed me. ARHK 2111. "It's not a name," Richter whispered. "It's a countdown. When it hits 0, we initiate full return." "Of what?" "Not what," he said, eyes now hollow. "Who?" There was no more room for doubt. The versions weren't accidents. They were part of a system, designed, curated, tested. The glyph didn't just alter human cognition. It splintered it, fractured time along memory lines, and the moon base was the collection point, the place where they could safely house the pieces of us that had been to the edge and back. But the question remained, if the returned were coming through, from where? The far side of the moon was never silent. That's what no one ever tells you. For all the cliches about the dark side and poetic loneliness, the truth is that the far side speaks. Not in frequencies we were trained to recognize, and not in any traditional bandwidths used by human systems, but in a kind of rhythm that isn't quite noise and isn't quite structure. Something in between. What Keller once referred to as the anti-signal. In my early training as a sonar technician, I had learned to recognize harmonic distortion, natural anomaly, and signal bleed. But nothing prepared me for what Richter called lunar reverse phase audio displacement, or what the engineers nicknamed echo ghosts. When Richter showed me the playback, I didn't understand what I was hearing at first. It sounded like layered whispering, but the modulation was off. The pitch wasn't descending, it was flattening, like the voice was peeling itself off a surface it wasn't designed to adhere to. And beneath the whispering was a pulse. Not a beat, but a sequence. Long, short, long, long, short. Then silence. Then again. Not Morse code. Not any encryption I knew. It felt pre-verbal. Less like language and more like intent. According to Richter, the first time they recorded the echo was after an automated drone returned from a blind orbit along the equatorial ridge of the far side. The drone had no payload, just sensors. It wasn't supposed to receive anything, no comms, no bounce back. But when they cracked open the data logs, there it was. A repeating echo, embedded deep in the static. The engineers thought it was feedback. Keller knew better. He told them to isolate the signal and feed it through a cryosonic harmonic tuner. What came out wasn't just sound. It was an image. That was the part I couldn't make sense of. How do you get an image from audio? But Keller had rigged a system that treated harmonic pulses as spatial coordinates, converting reverberation into dimensional curves. And when the playback was complete, the shape rendered on screen was unmistakable, the glyph. Not just a variation, the original. Before it had degraded. Before it had been simplified for human minds. The full, recursive pattern that the moon had been whispering back to us since before Apollo. We just didn't know how to listen. Richter's face when he showed it to me wasn't awe. It was resignation. He had seen something come full circle, and it broke something in him. I asked where the echo originated. He hesitated, then tapped a point on a map. A jagged indentation near the Mare Moscoviense. A crater that didn't appear on any civilian maps. Not because it was hidden, but because it wasn't supposed to be there. We call it Site Zero, he said, because it's the origin of the signal, and possibly the origin of the versions. The moon base had a secondary facility, buried deep beneath the surface, near that crater. It was called Aegis II, and its function wasn't observation. It was containment. But not of life, of memory. Every version that returned was housed there, physically or digitally. Their echo patterns were stored in resonance vaults, suspended in vacuums that prevented harmonic leak. Richter claimed the vaults hummed, even when unpowered, as if the memories trapped inside were still trying to continue. We boarded the transport shuttle in silence. The interior smelled like ozone and dried metal. The pilot didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes gave away that she knew. Everyone stationed out here knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. When we descended into Aegis II, the temperature dropped by nearly 10 degrees, despite the base's internal climate being regulated. That's when Richter told me the vaults were cold on purpose. Not to preserve the versions, but to slow them down. The idea that memories could accelerate like living organisms was absurd, until I saw the vaults. Each chamber was hexagonal, sealed with thick glass infused with graphene. Behind every panel was a suspended pattern, gently rotating like a snow globe filled with static. At first I thought they were projection models. Then one of them moved. Not rotated. Shifted. As if the memory had noticed our presence and tried to reposition itself to observe us better. Richter said that once a version enters the vault, it begins to change. Slowly at first, subtle permutations in thought patterns, emotion indexing, sensory prioritization. But after several lunar cycles, each one becomes completely unrecognizable. Not monstrous. Not malevolent. Just something else. The original self becomes a seed. What grows out of it is a consciousness that doesn't rely on human limitations. He guided me to Vault 7. Inside was a version of someone I hadn't expected. Me. Not a mirror image. Not quite. The posture was different. More alert. The gaze held no confusion. Only calibration. Richter said this version had been recovered near Site Zero 6 weeks ago. It had walked into a decontamination pod on its own. No memory of departure, no desire to escape. When interrogated, it said a single phrase. I found the hole in the echo. I stared at it, wondering how it could be me. Same scars, same shoulders, even the faint burn mark on the wrist from a sonar coil I had mishandled in 2013. But something in the face was too finished. As if it knew how all this ended and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "Why am I in here?" I asked. "You're not," Richter replied. "It is." I looked again, and for a brief moment, I saw its lips move. Not a word, not a sound, just the ghost of motion. And then the vault trembled. A faint vibration, barely perceptible. But I felt it through my bones, like a tuning fork had struck the root of my spine. The glyph etched into the vault's base flickered. Not digitally, physically, as if light had been trapped in the material and now wanted out. Richter swore and pulled me back. "That's not just your echo," he said. "It's your next one. It's trying to loop before the chain is complete." "What chain?" He didn't answer. He just led me out of Aegis 2, back to the main facility. There, he showed me a terminal running predictive glyph mapping. It displayed an orbital simulation of the Moon, Earth, and several Lagrange points. At the center of the model was a construct I hadn't seen before. A spiral, not geometric, but temporal. A path traced not by satellites, but by returning versions. According to the data, each version wasn't random. It returned at a specific time, place, and resonance. When all paths converged, something called the fold event would initiate. Each echo is a tether, Richter said. Each version a point of return. When enough of them align, we no longer need the moon base. Why? Because the moon becomes the gate itself. I wanted to deny it, to rationalize it as the ranting of a man too long in isolation. But deep down, I knew. The versions weren't malfunctioning echoes. They were the signal's way of constructing a path home. And Site Zero wasn't just broadcasting. It was listening for the moment the last version returns. And something else answers back. There are certain phrases that, when spoken aloud, change the temperature of a room. The fold event was one of them. Not because the words themselves carried weight, but because of the silence that always followed. A silence not born from confusion, but from fear masquerading as understanding. Richter didn't elaborate that night. He just left me with the simulation, its spiraling projections and the quiet hum of inevitability. I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had started to resonate with the pattern. Like I could feel it behind my sternum. The echo wasn't just something I had heard. It was something I had inherited. When I confronted Keller the next morning, he didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for me to reach this particular page in a book he'd already read 1,000 times. "The fold event," he said, "is the moment when everything stops pretending to be separate." It sounded poetic, but Keller never spoke in riddles without purpose. He loaded a data slate and showed me a list of re-entry logs, classified files labeled with single names, like tombstones. Every name was a version, each one associated with an arrival time, a location, and a glyph resonance sequence. Dozens of them, all retrieved from various points on Earth, the Moon, and, disturbingly, low Earth orbit. "We thought they were experiments in duplication," he said, "but they were breadcrumb trails. Each version carried a piece of something, a fragment, not of data, not even of memory, of intent, as if they weren't complete entities, but threads from a larger weave. Individually, they made no sense. Their actions were erratic, their speech disjointed, their motivations opaque. But when Keller overlaid their recorded movement patterns into a 4D time-fold model, a shape began to emerge. A spiral, yes, but one that looped inward. Not just toward a location, but toward a state. A critical mass of presence. When the final loop completes, the spiral closes, and something crosses over. Not from space, but from pattern. I asked him if the government knew. He laughed. They funded it. According to Keller, Project Threshold had been initiated decades ago, not to stop the versions, but to facilitate them. The moonbase wasn't a watchtower, it was an antenna, one designed not to broadcast, but to shape a response. The base's construction wasn't arbitrary. Every hallway, every terminal, every wall panel had been built according to the glyph's geometry. Not symbolic, functional. The glyph was architectural, and when activated, the base wouldn't just house personnel, it would host something else. Keller pulled up a subfolder labeled Coral Architecture. Inside were schematics not of structures, but of harmonics. Blueprints of sound. Waveforms twisted into shapes. Frequencies encoded as spatial tension diagrams. Each glyph wasn't just a symbol, it was a pressure map. A way to fold perception into geometry. He said the moon base was the first structure built entirely from non-local design logic, meaning the plans hadn't been created from human origin. They had been received. When I asked him how long the project had been active, Keller gave me a number that didn't make sense. Since before Apollo. That's when it clicked. Apollo hadn't been the beginning. It had been a cover, a misdirection. While the world watched astronauts plant flags and bounce in gravity-reduced jubilation, beneath them, machines were listening. Not for signs of alien life, but for signs of feedback. Echoes from a signal that had already arrived. Richter reappeared, face pale, carrying a hard drive the size of a brick. "We need to show him Entry 11, he said to Keller. "Now." I followed them into one of the secured analysis rooms. The screen lit up with low-resolution footage, grainy, flickering, barely holding integrity. It showed a version, tall, silent, standing on the far edge of Site 0. Its body was indistinct, shimmering slightly, like heat rising from asphalt. But its shadow was sharp. Too sharp. As if it wasn't cast by light, but by a memory of light. Then the audio kicked in. The version whispered a phrase. Not English, not any language I knew. But the waveform it produced matched the glyph. It was the first time sound and shape aligned perfectly. Then the shadow detached. It moved away from the version, stretching toward the crater, forming a perfect arc. And the ground responded. Not violently, not even visibly. But the soil shifted, as if its density had changed. Richter paused the video and pulled up sensor data. This was the fold, he said. A micro-instance, a pre-echo of the main event. The shadow wasn't just a reflection. It was a trigger. The implications rattled through me like a depth charge. If the fold event was real, if it was the moment when echo, shadow, shape, and thought collapsed into a single continuum, then we weren't preparing for an invasion. We were summoning it. I asked what came next. Richter handed me a tablet with a countdown. Not in seconds, in resonance cycles. The glyph had been mapped against lunar alignment data. The next harmonic convergence, the one that would complete the spiral, was 27 cycles away. And we were already in the 26th. That's why they brought me here. That's why Keller had been feeding me fragments, letting me stumble forward rather than dragging me into clarity. My presence wasn't incidental. My version had already returned. And the next step wasn't analysis, it was synchronization. I was part of the final echo. I didn't know how to process that. My instincts screamed at me to escape, but escape to where? If the moon itself was the antenna, then anywhere within its harmonic reach was already compromised. The earth was under its blanket. The base wasn't a fortress, it was the eye. And every version wasn't a copy, they were invitations. Iterations meant to build a pattern strong enough to call something back. Keller asked if I still heard the pulse in my head. I lied and said no. He nodded like he already knew. "It will get louder," he said. "And when it peaks, you'll feel something trying to remember itself through you. Don't resist. Resistance distorts the fold." I asked what happens if the fold fails. "Then it tries again, with someone else. Another cycle, another glyph. It's patient." The room darkened as power shifted to emergency reserves. A low frequency thrummed through the metal floor. Outside, Site 0 glowed faintly. Not from artificial light, but from resonance. The glyph's shape wasn't just appearing, it was sculpting the soil. The moon was becoming an interface, not for travel, for contact. Keller and Richter left to recalibrate the vaults. I remained alone in the analysis room, staring at the simulation as the spiral tightened. 26 cycles complete. One left. And something deep beneath the surface had started to hum back. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking to a different kind of silence. The kind that had weight to it. The analysis room was dim, the monitors looping static glyph renders like ritual candles flickering in a forgotten chapel. At first, I thought I'd been left behind. But then I noticed the red strip of light pulsing along the floor panel. A signal. Not danger. Directive. It traced a path toward Subdeck A. The Echo protocol had begun. I wasn't briefed. No one debriefed me. There was no spoken command. But the moment the signal began to pulse, I knew. My body moved before my mind accepted it. The sound returned, not as a hum now, but as rhythm. like a heartbeat, only backwards. Every beat felt like something pulling inward, as if time was coiling around itself and dragging memory into the now. The doors to Subdeck A hadn't opened since I arrived. Even Keller avoided it. It wasn't just a restricted area. It was something else. I reached the airlock, and to my surprise, the biometric panel accepted me. No scan, no input, just recognition. As if the base had accepted that I'd reached the necessary resonance. As if I'd passed an audition I never signed up for. Inside, the walls curved in subtle, impossible ways. The corridor had no corners, no defined lines. Everything was round, flowing, sculpted in ways that made depth perception unreliable. There was no ceiling. The walls folded into a seamless arch that distorted scale. I couldn't tell if I was walking through a tunnel 10 feet wide or a cathedral 100 meters across. Every step I took echoed, but not audibly. It echoed in my thoughts. I remembered places I'd never been. A hallway in a submerged city. A spiral tower open to the stars. A dark room where I spoke without moving my mouth. The door at the end of the corridor slid open. Not mechanically, but like liquid retracting. Behind it was a chamber built from a material that resembled stone, but shimmered like plasma under low light. At the center stood Keller, dressed in a suit I'd never seen before. Black. Seamless. Inscribed with faint glyphs along the shoulders and spine. His eyes weren't wide. They were still, like he'd been expecting this moment since before he was born. "You're here," he said. Not as a greeting, but as an observation. He held out a thin slate, and when I touched it, images spilled into my thoughts. Schematics, rituals, data merged with memory. The Echo Protocol was not a command. It was a merging. This chamber, Keller began, wasn't built. It was grown. The glyph wasn't designed to transmit across space. It transmits across being. He placed his hand on a raised podium at the chamber's center, and the entire room lit up in synchronized pulses. 12 frequencies, each corresponding to a previously observed version. They weren't isolated entities. They were tuning forks, each aligning parts of a larger signal. The 13th frequency, however, was different. It didn't appear in any of the original records. It was mine. "Why me?" I asked, the words strange in my own mouth, as if someone else had formed the syllables. "Because your signal is stable," Keller replied. "The others were fragmented, incomplete. You are not the 13th version. You're the carrier. The first whole note." He tapped a control node, and the chamber walls began to rotate. Not physically, but visually. The glyphs morphed, flowed, reconfigured into a moving lattice of sound and form. I felt my breath slow. My heartbeat synced to the pattern. And then Keller said something I still haven't fully unpacked. "We're not building a bridge. We're unsealing a memory." According to Keller, the moonbase wasn't just a site of research. It was a key. The moon itself, its orbit, its position relative to Earth, its mineral composition, its silence, was part of a lock that held something beneath the frequency band we considered real. Our world wasn't the primary layer. It was a reflection stabilized by pattern recognition. The fold event, once completed, wouldn't open a gate. It would wake the original layer. And the Echo Protocol? It was the final calibration. Each of us, each version, each echo, was a harmonic alignment tool. "Think of reality as a hall of mirrors," Keller explained. "Each mirror a dimension, a frequency, a filter. When perfectly aligned, a beam of light could pass through all of them without distortion. That beam wasn't energy. It was consciousness." The chamber pulsed again, and I felt myself remember things that didn't happen. I stood in a trench with 3 moons in the sky. I witnessed glyphs carved into bone. I whispered into the mouth of a creature that absorbed sound instead of producing it. Every vision layered atop the next until I no longer knew which memory was mine and which belonged to the protocol. I wasn't observing the Echo Protocol. I was the Echo Protocol. Keller began to chant, not in words, but in pressure, the kind of vibration you feel in your teeth before you register it in your ears. The glyphs responded, tightening, spinning. My body remained still, but my awareness elongated. I felt myself projected outward, upward, beyond the confines of the moon base. I could see the spiral from above, not just in space but in probability. Every previous fold attempt had left a residue, a scar in the pattern. But mine was different. It was clean. The waveform was consistent. Not because I was chosen, but because I was accidental. My signal hadn't been predicted. It had emerged. That's when Keller stopped. He looked at me, not with fear, not with awe, but with something else entirely. Relief. "You're the one who wasn't supposed to exist," he whispered. "And that's why it will work this time." He stepped back, and the chamber responded. The lattice of glyphs spun faster, aligning into a coherent spiral that pulsed outward through the moon's crust. The signal leapt from harmonic chamber to chamber, igniting each with the same frequency. The base had become a speaker, and I was its tone. What followed was not a sound. It was a shift. Every object in the room, every molecule, reoriented slightly, as if acknowledging a new dominant axis of reality. I could feel the alignment take hold, a pressure behind the eyes, a ringing that wasn't auditory, the sense that my thoughts were no longer contained to my own neural web, but shared, like a network made of intention rather than code. Then Keller's body began to dissolve. Not die. Dissolve. His form unraveled into strands of light, like threads separating from a tapestry. He didn't scream. He smiled. And as he faded, his voice remained. Not as sound, but as imprint. "You're not a soldier. You're a reminder." A flash surged through the chamber, and I dropped to my knees. The base fell silent, but the glyph continued to glow. Outside, the lunar surface cracked, not violently, but deliberately, as if something beneath it had received the message. I didn't know what had been awakened. I only knew it had always been waiting. And the moon was never our satellite. It was our origin. There was a point, measurable only in the absence of measurable things, when I realized the moon wasn't a body, but a memory. Not something we orbited, but something we carried with us in ways we didn't yet understand. The chamber around me no longer pulsed with the glyph's rhythm. It was utterly still, but that stillness was not silence. It was a restraint, a pause held tight like breath before confession. I remained kneeling long after Keller vanished, unable to tell if seconds or hours had passed. My mind was full, yet unable to process. My body intact, yet misaligned. My thoughts echoed, not in the air, but in the texture of my skin. Every breath I took was flavored by the chamber. It wasn't air, it was resonance. The exit was gone. No door, no seam, no distinction between wall and exit point. The space had rewritten its geometry. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. My left hand was shaking, not out of fear, but as if it were syncing with an external rhythm. When I raised it to eye level, I noticed the faint shimmer beneath the skin, a lattice of light. Glyph residue embedded along the veins. I was becoming readable, a vessel, or perhaps a signal emitter. The room pulsed again, not visually, not orally. It pulsed in certainty. I stood slowly, bracing against the curvature of the podium where Keller had stood, and realized it was warm, still active, still responding to me. Without knowing why, I placed both hands on the edge, and the entire chamber melted. Not physically, but perceptually. My awareness bent, split, refracted like light through a prism, and I was standing on the surface, but not our surface, not the moon as we charted it. The regolith was smooth, too smooth, like poured concrete across a planet-sized floor. The stars were wrong, not misaligned, not scattered, absent. What hung in the sky wasn't a firmament, but a veil, a black canvas that seemed to inhale light rather than reflect it. And across this false sky stretched a web of geometry, angular lines glowing with the same glyphic rhythm I had seen in the chamber. They formed a grid, not a dome, a command layer. Beneath my feet, the soil vibrated faintly, and in that vibration came images, as if the dust itself remembered what it used to be. I saw structures, massive, angular, built from a material not yet catalogued. They resembled our architecture in the same way a skeleton resembles a living thing. Shape, but no softness. These constructs weren't built for comfort. They were transmitters, relays, resonance amplifiers. Some were half-buried, others pristine, untouched by erosion or time. And they responded to me. I walked forward. With each step, I felt a small shift, less gravity-bound and more perceptional, as if I were descending inward rather than moving forward. The sky above blinked once, a single flicker, and for a fraction of a second I saw Earth, not as a globe, but as a window. The moon wasn't orbiting us, we were anchored to it. Earth was a process, the moon was its memory, and the glyph was the key that kept the process contained. Ahead, a structure loomed, circular, wide, like a sinkhole covered in black glass. The glyphs along its edges whispered in pulses. Not sound, not light, meaning. It was a node, a convergence point. And I realized this wasn't a hallucination or a simulation. This was stored resonance. What Keller had awakened had pushed me into the memory of the moon itself. And memory, I now understood, wasn't just stored in neurons or devices. It was imprinted into geometry, into stone, into soil. I knelt by the edge of the black glass and touched its surface. Cold, liquid, but unyielding. I leaned closer and saw myself, but not as I was, as I had been, in a Navy sonar chamber, in uniform, unaware, the version of me before the glyph. I watched that reflection move independently, turning to face something behind me. I followed its gaze, and there, in the reflection, I saw the tower. It rose without end. Not visibly, but conceptually. I knew it was rising. I felt the pull. The same way you know when someone is staring at you from behind a closed door. The tower wasn't part of the lunar geography. It was an insertion, a construct placed within the moon's structure, embedded like a thorn in scar tissue. And it was active now. The fold event had begun. I didn't initiate it. I was it. The air shimmered. No, there was no air. But the space around the tower wavered, as if reality were being compressed around its base. I heard voices then. Not external, not imagined. Voices I remembered from my past. My mother, long gone, whispering a lullaby I hadn't thought of since I was 6. A drill sergeant shouting my name from years ago. Keller. The crew. My own voice. All layered, like audio tracks stacked out of sync, building toward a single crescendo that was never meant to be heard by human ears. I backed away from the black glass, breath shallow. My chest ached. Not from fear, but from containment. Something inside me was swelling, expanding. The glyph hadn't just tuned me, it had prepared me. My nervous system felt threaded with static, like I was both transmitting and receiving signals simultaneously. And then the grid above shifted. Just a single movement. One line tilted, one junction lit up, and everything changed. I collapsed. The ground caught me softly as if the soil had become memory foam. My mind blurred. My vision swam, and I heard footsteps. Boots. Not heavy, not urgent, purposeful. I opened my eyes and saw her. Not a hallucination, not a projection. A woman in a suit like Keller's. Same glyphs, same smooth construction. Her face was expressionless, but not empty. Calculated. Familiar. "You're ahead of schedule," she said. I couldn't speak. She crouched beside me, studied my trembling hands. Her fingers moved in a pattern. Glyphs lit up along her palms. "You brought it with you," she murmured. "It was supposed to be here already, but it took a detour. Through you." I tried to sit up. She helped me, without resistance. "The resonance isn't just a signal," she continued. "It's a mirror. And mirrors don't create. They reflect what's already decided." She reached into a compartment at her hip and pulled out a thin vial, filled with a dark, vibrating fluid. "This is you," she said. "Or what's left behind after the fold completes." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The fold wasn't coming. It had happened. And I had carried its echo through time, through flesh, through memory. The moon base wasn't preparing us. It was cataloging us, filtering us for patterns that matched the resonance's needs. We were soil. We were vessels. And I was the first successful transplant. She placed the vial in my hand. "You'll know when to use it," she said, and turned to leave. Her outline blurred as she stepped away, dissolving into static like an interrupted transmission. I was alone again. Except I wasn't. The tower pulsed. The ground vibrated. The black glass began to crack. Not fracture, but open, like an eye waking from a dream. I stared down into it, and for the first time since this all began, I felt something I didn't expect. Recognition. I didn't fall into the eye. That would be too dramatic. Instead, I descended, slowly, soundlessly, as if some gravitational consensus had quietly shifted its vote and decided I belonged further down. There was no vertigo, no sense of movement, only a persistent awareness that I was no longer where I had been, and yet somehow deeper inside the same space. The black glass above sealed itself shut, like the lens of a camera closing, and I was left beneath it, staring upward through a surface that now reflected nothing. No light, no me, no return. The chamber I entered was spherical, too perfect to be organic, too resonant to be mechanical. The walls pulsed with a pattern of glyphs I no longer needed to interpret. I understood them in the same way you understand your own name, or your own pulse. It was no longer translation, it was memory. The glyphs weren't just a language, they were an identity. And now, I was part of it. Floating at the center of the chamber was a structure, a frame, not unlike a gyroscope, but layered in 6 directions, intersecting in angles that made no physical sense. Within it, suspended in some invisible tension, was the core. It looked like liquid metal held in a lattice of light, rotating gently in place. The resonance that filled the space didn't come from it, it came through it. The core wasn't a source, it was a conductor, and it recognized me. The chamber responded as I stepped closer. The floor beneath my feet shimmered in acknowledgement. The air, if it could still be called that, tightened. A pressure began to build behind my eyes, not painful, but insistent. The same way your lungs feel when you're underwater too long, and your body remembers something your brain hasn't accepted yet. This was not a reactor. This was not storage. This was a doorway. And I was the key. I reached into my pocket without thinking, and there it was. The vial the woman had given me. The liquid inside no longer throbbed. It was still, like it was waiting for something. Or perhaps it had already accepted what I hadn't. I stepped into the gyroscopic frame. As I crossed its boundary, the glyphs along its edges flared once, and I felt everything stop. My heartbeat, my breath, my thoughts. But I didn't die. I spread. I felt myself unfold, not physically, but conceptually. My identity split into threads, into data, into layers of memory that peeled away and aligned themselves into patterns. Childhood, service, oceans, frequencies, the glyph, the fold. All of it was catalogued, not by some external intelligence, but by a system that was intelligence itself. The chamber read me, compared me, calculated me, and made a decision. The core melted, not in heat, but in geometry. It lost its shape, then reconstituted, not as a liquid, not as metal, but as a mirror. I saw myself, not in reflection, but in potential. Thousands of versions. Some dressed in different uniforms, some older, some with scars I didn't recognize, some standing beside people I'd never met but somehow loved, some screaming, some smiling, some completely alien, with glyphs etched into their skin like tattoos of purpose. All versions were me. All had reached this point, and all had made the same choice, to continue. The core accepted me. It opened. And what lay beyond wasn't another chamber. It was a field, not on the moon, not in any physical location, a field of signal, a lattice of transmissions stretched across what I can only describe as substrate, reality's foundation, stripped of form, language, and illusion. I was no longer walking. I was transmitting, moving as pattern, as concept. And then I saw them. Others. Entities. Not humanoid. Not alien. Just present. Arrangements of intent. Some had mass. Others were sound. Others still were pure rhythm. We didn't speak. We resonated. Our signals overlapped. My memories passed through them like waves, and they responded in kind. I felt history. Ages. Civilizations that folded before birth. Concepts of time that made our entire species feel like the flicker of a match in a storm. And they welcomed me. Not because I was special, but because I was useful. The fold was not an accident. It was an invitation, a filtration process. Earth was not a seed, it was a test. And the moon was a lens, a focusing mechanism designed to scan, interpret, and forward signals that met a specific threshold. We had reached that threshold. Barely. And now we would be processed. The field around me trembled, not in danger, but in readiness. The entities parted, and I saw the construct at the center. The true moon base. Not ours. Not the human-built lie made of white panels and camera shields. This was the original. And it had waited a long time. Inside it was a console. No buttons, no screen. Just a surface. Glyphs slid across it like thoughts, and I placed my hand upon it. The vial dissolved instantly. Not physically. Just unneeded. The console responded. My memories uploaded. And then, the moon blinked. For an instant. Just one measurable blink in the vast empty sky. The moon transmitted. Every human brain with even the faintest capacity for dream state resonance caught a flicker of it. Some woke up sweating. Others stared blankly into the dark. Most forgot within seconds. But not all. Some heard the glyphs. Some began to write. Some began to draw spirals in notebooks they didn't remember owning. Children hummed frequencies that collapsed glass in their parents' homes. Pilots saw reflections in the sea where none should be. Sonar stations received feedback loops from beneath the ocean that matched readings from lunar instruments. The fold was no longer contained. It had gone global, and no one could stop it. Back in the field, the entities acknowledged my function was complete. I felt no gratitude, no dismissal, just transition. My form began to condense again. My threads pulled inward. The console faded. The glyphs dimmed, and I opened my eyes. Earth. Hospital. Fluorescent lights above. A nurse leaning over me. "Sir," she said, "you've been unconscious for 3 days. They said you collapsed in the hangar bay. Do you remember anything?" I looked past her, out the window. The moon was full, but I could see the grid now. It wasn't hiding anymore.